felons have their rights back, should they be allowed to carry firearms? If felons have a First Amendment, they have a Fourth Amendment right, and they have a Fifth Amendment, why aren't they allowed their Second Amendment? This is something that the Supreme Court is going to take up this year, and I wanted to talk about. Well, in 2024, a guy named Duarte took his case, his felon in possession of a firearms case, which was a federal case, to the appeals court. In the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, they actually ruled that his conviction as a felon in possession of a firearm was unconstitutional due to the Breun test. The Breun test is exactly how Roe v. Wade was overturned. The Breun test is where the Supreme Court looks at a law and says, is it analogous to a law that was designed when the Constitution was enacted? And it's almost impossible to find a law against any firearm when the Constitution was enacted, because the Second Amendment states fairly plainly your right to carry should not be infringed. So back to Duarte. Duarte's case was vacated, and of course he already served his time, so it really doesn't help him out too much. But the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals actually decided to hear the entire case en banc, which means the entire court assembled to hear this. In July of 2025, the Ninth Circuit en banc court overturned the ruling of the unconstitutionality. So what they basically said was, felon in possession of a firearm is a legal law in California. So this brings up a bigger issue, right? Is a felon a citizen? Or do we have second-class citizens in America? If the First Amendment applies, and the Fourth Amendment applies, and the Fifth Amendment applies, why doesn't the Second Amendment apply? So this year, probably in June, the Supreme Court is going to hear from both sides on this argument. The government has to present a lot of hard evidence. What they need to do is they're going to have to prove that there's some sort of historical tradition to disarm somebody. Because according to Breun, they have to have historical analogy. They have to have a law that existed during the time of the enactment of the Constitution that is like the law they're proving is constitutional. So I don't know anybody in the government that's going to present the case, but the only thing that I can think of that they would try to present is laws disarming like loyalists to England. People who were loyal to the crown, they actually got disarmed. People who were mentally put in asylums, they weren't actually disarmed, but they were put into an asylum, so they're going to say that they weren't allowed to own firearms because they were in an institution. It's a very difficult argument to make for the government. They're going to have a lot of difficulty putting this argument together, because what they have to prove and the guidelines they're going to have to meet are almost impossible. I mean, the language of the Second Amendment is pretty simple. Shall not be infringed is about the most strict legal language you can think of. Another thing that people don't realize is the laws of the 1700s didn't care about the future. They were basically saying that right now in the present moment, if the act is dangerous, then they have to do something about it. Otherwise, they weren't worried about a lot of the little things that Americans are worried about today with laws. Like, if you'd have tried to submit a drug law back in the 1700s, they'd have laughed at you. The government's biggest hurdle is they're going to have to admit that they want to create a second-class citizenship. Because if you don't allow everybody the same rights, then you have two classes. And if you take any right away from any group of people, then you're admitting that you have a second class. And that's something that the U.S. prides herself on, that there's no classes, that we're all the same, right? But is the Supreme Court going to split the baby? Are they going to say that nonviolent felons and violent felons are different? This is the logical argument. This is the middle road, right? But how do you now define what's violent and what's nonviolent? And who gets to do that? I personally think that if the Supreme Court makes a fair ruling, they're going to have to throw the 922 G1 out.